Non-major.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, education, education, education was originally a cry by Lenin, who did not mean it either. The Secretary of State, who has just left, I suspect does mean it. I think he is sincere. And I would like to congratulate the Secretary of State in his unavoidable absence on adopting some proposals from my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, and for doing so gracefully. I think that is as welcome as it is unusual. And I hope governments of both complexions in the future may feel inclined to follow that particularly good example. Now, if I can turn to the budget as a whole, I'm very pleased that the Chancellor has cut taxes in the budget and given back to taxpayers a small proportion of the money that he has extracted from them over the past 4 years. Now, I don't think there's any surprise in this generosity. The problems of foot and mouth notwithstanding, there's an election pending, and the public accounts show ample scope for tax reductions and perhaps modest expenditure increases as well. And yet, just a few weeks ago, when the opposition said this, they were condemned as irresponsible by Treasury and other spokesmen. And we can now see how shallow those attacks were. For if it was irresponsible, why has this most prudent of chancellors actually done it? And the truth was that my right honourable and honourable friends in opposition were right to identify scope for tax reduction. And not only were they right, I believe if the economy stays on course, there may be scope for yet more tax cuts in future. Now, why is this? One principal reason for this remarkable leeway, is the sheer size of the tax increases over the past 4 years. Now, let us disentangle fact from fiction. Even prior to this budget, there were 26 increases in personal taxation and 19 increases in taxes on business in this Parliament. Now, this has risen slightly, although given the Chancellor's remarkable gift for sleight of hand, one needs to study the small print carefully to find out precisely how many. But one thing is clear. The sum total of these tax increases is enormous. The abolition of tax credits on dividends alone will cost shareholders around $6 billion in the current tax year. The reorganisation of advanced corporation tax at the beginning of this Parliament has cost pension funds and the quality of pensions for millions of elderly people over £5 billion during the course of this Parliament, and will do continuing damage until it is changed in future. Now, even after minor offsetting tax reductions, and there had been some, and they mostly were minor, the overall tax yield to inland revenue has risen by an astonishing 1/3 during the passage of this Parliament, and no wonder the savings ratio has fallen so badly. And independent surveys, not sort of wicked Tory calculations, independent surveys show the average family to be actually worse off than they were in 1996. Even that old tax until the pipsqueak bruiser, the Right Honourable and Noble Lord Healy, must be salivating with envy at the extent of the tax rises forced through by this Chancellor. Now, more people have been dragged into tax, an extra 2 million, 28 million pay tax now as compared to 26 million 3 years ago. Over the same period, if it's nonsense, it's Red Book nonsense. It comes from the Red Book. That's right. So the honourable gentleman, before he mutters into his non-existent beard, might go and read the Red Book and actually check. Now, maybe the Chancellor's given us some more duff facts. It's entirely possible. We're used to that from him. Absolutely. But if they are duff facts, it's his responsibility and not mine. So there are 2 million more taxpayers, and there are 700,000 more higher rate taxpayers than there were 4 years ago. And in addition to this, MIRAS has now been completely scrapped. I've no particular objection to that, except that not only has MIRAS been scrapped, but stamp duty on home purchase has been increased, NICs have risen sharply, national insurance contributions for middle-income earners. So much on the eve of this election, so much for the government's promises on the eve of the last election to Middle England and middle-income groups across the whole of the United Kingdom. They may care to note also that the yield from inheritance tax has soared 50% in this Parliament. And this Chancellor still has no concept. I genuinely believe he does not understand the value of letting more of the fruits of a lifetime of work filter down to the people the earner most cares about, his own family in the next generation. And it is no wonder with these tax increases that the ratio of tax to GDP has risen 2.5% to 37.7%. The Chancellor, despite all his promises, has not so much wooed Middle England as assaulted it. Yes, I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Yes, thank you very much for giving way. Does the right honourable member know that taking tax and borrowing together as a share of GDP, given that borrowing, of course, is deferred taxation, that figure went from 38.2% in 1996-97 down to 36.2%, 2 points lower, 99-100, down to 34.1 this current year, the current one due to Spectrum, but the previous year, those 2 points is equivalent to an increase of 7.3p in income tax. In other words, he simply borrowed instead of tax and tried to fiddle the figures.
As it happens, the honourable gentleman ought to know his Chancellor changed the way in which the figures are quoted in the Red Book, and the equivalent actually of what he's done is an extra 10p on tax. So the honourable gentleman may care to examine that. Now, it is ironic. Well, if it's nonsense, again, it's the government's nonsense in the government's own figures. Those are the figures I'm using. I'm glad to hear from them that they don't believe them. Now, it's ironic that this government and this Chancellor has increased taxes so much, because I remember vividly in the last Parliament the Chancellor and his colleagues ever ready to find a catchy slogan, repeating and repeating the slander of 22 Tory tax rises with no acknowledgement whatsoever of any offsetting tax reductions. Now, to call these attacks disingenuous would be kind. They were patently untrue and a forerunner of the manipulation of facts that has characterised so much, not all, but so much of what this government has done and said in the past 4 years. Now, the government can't deny that, because the figures for tax increases are now clear, and the statistics cast light where the slogans cast deception. And pre-budget, the real increase in taxes over this Parliament is about 4.5% per annum. Obviously now a tiny bit lower, but not all that much. And that compares to 1.8% between 1979 and 1997. In fact, I'm indebted to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. In fact, as Dave pointed out, it was 2% between tax rises per annum between 1979 and 1990, and 1.3% between 1990 and 97. So much for the 22 Tory tax rises, or indeed the unsustainable proposition, unsustainable except by malice, that the last government wrecked the Tory tradition for low taxes. And even some of my right honourable and honourable friends who rather timidly accepted that fiction in the early part of this Parliament can now feel comforted that it was not true and refute it. They need not concede, but may safely move on and reassert our traditional tax credentials. Taxes were not unduly increased, despite the pressures of a recession that began in the 1980s and cast its shadow into the 1990s. But not, for the point of the health of the economy, much beyond 1992, because the Chancellor is still ever ready to gloss over the excellent parts of his inheritance. He cherry-picks the bits upon which he can make party political capital, and I don't blame him for that. Most politicians do that. But he misses other bits. He is, after all, a very political Chancellor who wishes to be Prime Minister and is doing a bit of image building. Now, a little more fact rather than some of the fiction we hear so often. This economy has actually been growing steadily since 1992, before, and some may not wish to hear this next point, before sterling actually left the exchange rate mechanism. And unemployment has also been falling since that economic recovery began, and job growth, very welcome job growth across the country, both in the number of jobs and the variety of jobs, has been consistent throughout then in the last Parliament and in this Parliament as well. Now, inflation too began to decline in the early 1990s and has remained low. It now looks set to fluctuate only within historically narrow parameters. Yes, I will give way to the honourable gentleman now.
To the honourable member. I do think the Chancellor's been skilled, but also I put it in perspective that I think that there are others who contributed to this. There's the ebbs and flow of the economy, and I do accept to some extent that there was a growth in employment underway under the stewardship of the Right Honourable Member for Huntingdon. The only reason I intervene is that it's still breathtaking when he asserts that somehow people are worse off today than they were in 1996. It just defies belief and the litmus paper test of what one sees and feels. People are in jobs now where there was still extensive and widespread unemployment amongst poor people in particular, unskilled people, during the period which he's referring to. So I don't apportion credit or blame on the question of employment. It's simply that people are in jobs. Demonstrably, they are better off now.
Demonstrably, the people in jobs are better off. That's undeniably so. I was referring to the scale of tax increases, and I think if the honourable gentleman looks at some of the independent research, he will see precisely why I made that comment. Now, as it happens, I was about to give some credit to the Chancellor. I was about to say the economy today is in good shape, and the Chancellor can take a great deal of satisfaction from that fact. And let me not be mealy-mouthed about it, he can take a good bit of credit for that fact as well. And if he were to be similarly candid, he too would offer credit to his predecessors, because the Chancellor has built upon what they did and upon a trend that was established 5 years before he went to the Exchequer. And for example, there is a tendency amongst some honourable members, maybe not all in this House, to believe that an economic miracle began on the 2nd of May 1997. Well, to take a random date, the 1st of May 1997. Growth was set to be 3.5% for the next year. Inflation was 2.6% and stable. Unemployment was falling rapidly and was down to just over, still very high, but just over 1.5 million. And the fiscal deficit was falling sharply, a point the Chancellor does invariably overlook because it is embarrassing to his campaign to discredit his predecessors. But the trend of a falling fiscal deficit was very clear, and it was falling very sharply. Now, the Chancellor can take credit that he has not wrecked that trend, but he cannot take credit for beginning that trend, for it preceded him by 4 years. Now, I welcome the fact that economic management has now reached a maturity in which the two major parties do not feel it necessary to reverse all the actions of their predecessors. I thoroughly welcome that. It is very beneficial for the British economy that that is the case, and will remain beneficial for as long as it's the case. Now, I may be wrong, but I think the Chancellor took that too far in the first 2 years by adopting the previous government's expenditure plans in toto. I can tell the House, I hope it's not a great shock, we certainly wouldn't have done that. We would have increased them in the 2 public expenditure rounds that followed, as we had in every public expenditure round since 1979. Stakhanovite is one word, masochistic perhaps is another, that might demonstrate a little more plainly the Chancellor's proposition. And he has been an economic masochist over public spending. Now, we hear a huge amount. The Secretary of State was at it a bit this afternoon as well. Despite the artificial hype about the unprecedented sums for health and education, the fact is the Chancellor has raised taxes by far more than he has increased expenditure. Now, the public haven't noticed that, because one of the skills the Chancellor has perfected is a skill at counting that includes the capacity to double count, overcount, and miscount. And the Chancellor has done that repeatedly. In fact, and here I'm indebted to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, total government spending in this Parliament has risen at 1.2% real a year. This is not only less than tax increases, it is less than economic growth. And it compares to public spending of 2.6% in the previous Parliament, a point Liberal spokesmen have often met. They don't often say anything nice about the Conservative Party, but they have repeatedly. I'm glad to see a nod of agreement rather than a shake of disagreement, and it is undoubtedly the case. Now, of course, I concede that much of that expenditure was not discretionary expenditure. It did result from the unavoidable impact of the recession. But it does it not, put in a better context that hoary old myth about Tory cuts, which the Prime Minister is trying to recycle at the moment with his current spate of posters about potential future Tory cuts. Now, either the Prime Minister's ill-informed or he's scaremongering, and probably the latter. Now, the government's publicity on cuts is familiar. It is an echo from the past. I have to tell the House it was a very odd experience in the last Parliament to be taunted on the one hand by the Labour Party over so-called cuts, while hostile monetarists attacked us for spending far too much money. The health of the economy, nothing's changed, says the Honourable Joe. Well, he may be right about that. The health of the economy in 1997 suggests, and the subsequent health suggests, that we might have got that balance about right. Now, during this Parliament, the Chancellor has benefited from several things. He's benefited from the supply-side reforms of the 1980s, and he's benefited from the disinflation brought about by the policies of the 1990s. And when he chants his mantra of boom and bust, and I lost count of the number of times he and the Prime Minister uttered this drivel last week, when he does that, he should remember the last unsustainable boom was well over a decade ago. Now, that hasn't stopped the Prime Minister depicting my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and my right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, as Mr. Boom and Mr. Bust. Now, this is, the Honourable Gentleman on the Treasury bench sniggers, but I have to say to him, this is simply the politics of sneer and jeer. Neither of my right honourable friends were policymakers at the time of the last boom, and had, in one case, had barely been in the House of Commons. Now, there is, of course, a boom and bust today, a boom in tax raising, and a bust in the competitiveness of manufacturing industry. Perhaps that's the boom and bust the Chancellor and the Prime Minister should concentrate on. Now, the fact is, I'll make a little progress if the Honourable Gentleman doesn't mind. The fact is, he tries to hide it, but it's evident, and he shouldn't hide it. From his perspective, he should not hide it. The fact is, this Chancellor is a redistributive Chancellor of the Exchequer. He aims to redistribute to the less well-off, but in general, he redistributes to the inland revenue. And even his well-intentioned schemes are not wholly successful. I don't disagree with all of them. There are bits of what the Chancellor has done that I think are good social justice, and if I had been in government with the economy he now has, I would have done some similar things. I would certainly have done some of the things the Chancellor's done, and I'm not remotely shy about saying that. But some of his well-intentioned schemes haven't been very successful. He abolished married couples allowance last year, and this year, with a 12-month helpful gap for the Treasury and Inland Revenue, he introduces a child tax credit to replace it. But many won't get it, because it's means-tested and millions will lose either some or all of it on the means-tested taper. And then the organisation of this tax credit is a total shambles. As it is based on the highest earning member of a household, it throws up huge and unacceptable anomalies. If, say, one parent works and earns $42,000 a year, no payment of this child tax credit is made. But if both parents are at work, with no one at home with the child at all, if both parents work and earn £35,000 each, then the full credit is payable. Now, in terms of social justice and attacking poverty and for low-income families with children, this is nonsense on stilts. And if the Chancellor was serious, he would have examined those problems and sought to correct them before introducing this in the present fashion and in the present way. And then there's the minimum income guarantee, Chancellor's safety net against poverty. It's so complex that over 1/3 of eligible pensioners don't claim it. And anyone who has seen the form can understand why a very large percentage of graduates might not claim it. So complex and absurd is it. And then there is the 10p band extension. Now, I think that is right in principle to minimise tax on the lower income groups. I don't disapprove of that. But it is so niggardly, so mean, as to be almost pointless. The maximum gain from the Chancellor's measures in this budget is, and this figure should strike a chord with members opposite, 75p a week. Given the previous response from pensioners to that, I'd have thought he'd have made it a little different. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, all economic management by every Chancellor of the Exchequer has many of its main effects become apparent some years after the original tax and spending decisions are announced. This Chancellor was lucky. He was lucky in his predecessors, lucky notably that my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, and my right honourable and noble friend, Lord Lamont, took very painful and unpopular decisions that contributed so much to the subsequent benevolent situation that the present Chancellor has made such use of in this Parliament. And unless my memory is failing, I seem to recall they did so in the teeth of unrelenting opposition, not least from the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Prime Minister. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will not be here in this House to see at first hand the Chancellor's legacy, but much of it is now predetermined. The Chancellor inherited an economy of falling unemployment and low inflation, and he has maintained it. That was well done. But under his stewardship also, taxes have risen too much. The tax system has become far more complex. Manufacturing industry has declined further. Regulations have soared. Increases in business taxes are undermining competitiveness, and so, in due course, will the social charter, the economic folly of which is not yet fully apparent, but will become so in due course. Now, this is, in truth, a mixed record, some good, some bad, but a mixed record for this luckiest and most fortunate of modern Chancellors of the Exchequer. Mr. Speaker, I cannot be certain, but this may well be the last occasion that I will speak in this House. Let me say it has been a privilege beyond measure to be here in this mother of parliaments. I hope that the next generation of honourable members, whichever of our great parties they may represent, will feel as I did when I first came into this House. I hope they will feel that way in future. And I hope we will be able to end the miserable political climate of spin and counterspin that has grown up in recent years. We need to separate fact from fiction, substance from soundbite, information from innuendo. The public, the electorate, the people who sent us here deserve more than to be spoon-fed a cocktail of headline-grabbing, feel-good stories. They deserve the truth, unvarnished sometimes, but the truth. And every member of this House, whether minister or backbencher, has the obligation, the duty, to provide it.
Jim Cunningham.
Can I say, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my opening remarks that I hope it's not the Honourable Gentleman's last speech in this chamber, because there is some things from time to time that you can agree with and there's other things you would disagree with, but at the same time we have all got to recognise that the Honourable Gentleman made some interesting contributions to the House over the years. In fact, he obviously ended up as Prime Minister as a result of that, so I hope that we'll hear him for one last time, even although he says things that sometimes on this side of the House we don't like. But that's the nature of politics and that's the nature of debate.